Okay, great. So I'm excited to present Yarn, which is an app for structuring storytelling with personal data. If you want an accessible version of the slides, they're available at that link on the bottom. That's cutt.ly/yarn slides. And you can also view the full paper, same domain /yarn paper. So personal tracking apps like Fitbit for physical activity, Swarm for location, have become increasingly ubiquitous. If you think about the availability of wearable devices, but also mobile apps that exist that allow people to track different aspects of their well-being and their lives. And it's fairly common for those apps to include social features. So for example, that might take the form of a social feed, like in the case of Swarm or in Fitbit, where you can see what your other friends and family members are doing, or that could be posts which are shared on external social platforms, like on Facebook or Twitter. And when designed well, those tools can help people get advice, get support, or be held accountable or celebrate achievements. But posts like this middle one, where this person went running and got a lot of likes and engagement, that level of support is actually fairly uncommon. And if we look at a post like this and compare it with what most posts look like, they tend to look like the post in the bottom right over here, where it's just a short description of what the person did with a hashtag and maybe a link to the data. And across the literature, those responses tend to get responses like this quote here. So I was kind of bummed. I was disappointed in my friends. It would be really awesome if you could, support me or help me be active when I post these things. Nobody cared. So most posts tend to emphasize this numeric data. They tend to appear very system generated and not elicit the response that people actually want. And so some literature has actually suggested that we need to think a little bit more about how to help people tell stories with their personal data. So in this paper, they write, to move beyond impersonal standard messages to fostering true connections between self-trackers and their various audiences, designs need to support those users in telling their story and sharing experiences with their data their way. And so this is really what we embody in this paper and in the design of Yarn, is we really look into how we can support people in telling stories and sharing experiences with their data their way. And so in particular, we aim to answer 3 questions. We first aim to answer the question of what stories do people want to use personal data to tell? We then explore how a design can structure storytelling to help people integrate that data. And so that led to the design of Yarn. And then the third question, we sought to evaluate that by understanding how story authors and their audiences feel about structured stories. And so we undertook a fairly standard human-centered design process in order to do that, where we first conducted 23 formative interviews with people who were telling a range of different stories. We then designed and developed Yarn, starting with paper prototypes and low fidelity prototypes, and ultimately settling on a mobile app. And then we evaluated Yarn in a field study with 21 participants. I'm going to mostly focus on these latter 2 research questions for the purposes of time, but I encourage you to look at the paper to understand a little bit better about how we got to these design recommendations that we put into Yarn. Okay, so now I'm going to talk a little bit about Yarn itself and the features that we included. So motivated by those formative interviews, we designed Yarn for telling 2 different types of stories, training for running races and completing home DIY projects. I don't have time to present all of the different features of Yarn, but I'll highlight a few of the key ones. And this link here shows the demo video if you want to see the whole process of what it's like to create a moment or a story within Yarn. And so in order to explain what we did in Yarn, I'm first going to highlight what a sharing experience normally looks like in apps which help people collect personal data. So I'm going to use Runkeeper as an example. And so by default, Runkeeper allows you to log your runs, and then you can share them to social media sites, for example. And you can create posts like the one that we saw before on the right over here. And so you can actually customize that message. You can change the text to say more than that you just completed an activity. You can do so by editing that tab to add a note field. And you can actually add a picture if you wanted to with this little icon down in the corner here. And so that can change your post from a message here to one which looks a little more like this, where this person is sharing their 4-kilometer run. They're sharing what's difficult about that run. It's their first time coming back from a while, and that they're making the best of the coronavirus situation. And then they included a photo of where they're running. So they've explained a little bit more about what's important to them about the run, and then they've included a little bit more visual evidence of what it was that they were doing. And so in the design of Yarn, we really tried to promote these kinds of elements. So for example, what we did in order to move people from tapping to add a note about what it was they were doing, we included description suggestions. So we wanted people to prompt conversation, ask for emotional support, ask for advice, that sort of thing. So for example, here, this description field suggests that people might want to enter what they want others to know, or how others can support them, or what advice that they're looking for. And then we facilitated optional and automatic data entry. So we included a variety of different data fields, and we treated them really as peers. So rather than treating the run or treating the activity as central and then other data as more as less in focus, we presented them as equal opportunities. And even if, as a person is creating a chapter like this one, they might not add a photo now, they would still then see that prominently as an option, and then think about whether they wanted to include a photo or other types of data as they went through when they went on a later run. And we included similar sorts of parameters in the DIY version of Yarn. We emphasized photos a little bit more because those are more central to how people wanted to present their progress, but also some numeric data like the amount of time that someone worked on their project in a given day, their expenses, or maybe even their mood. And so in what people actually created, we really wanted that to align with the reasons why people went and share in the first place. So people share for advice in order to get support, to celebrate. We actually made the visual content that people created represent that. So for example, if someone has the goal of getting advice, we really highlighted in a post that a person made that they asked a question. So we overlaid on top of the content that they created that they had a question. Similarly for support, if a person really wanted support, we highlighted that run was particularly difficult, or that they were having a hard time, in order to maybe elicit a little bit more of a support reaction. And if someone was trying to celebrate their journey, we highlighted all of the different moments that built to the current state that they're at. And then we gave some people some lightweight tools in order to configure that a little bit. So change the visual content, change the text message of what was being shown, in addition to selecting which of those templates they felt better fit their specific moment. So that was what we did in Yarn to help people better tell their stories their way. So I'm now going to switch over to the field study, where we actually went and we evaluated Yarn. So as I said before, we had 21 participants who used Yarn. They each used it for 4 weeks each, roughly evenly split between participants who were training for races and participants who were completing home DIY projects. Participants created on average about 2 different stories each. So they would, maybe they would tell the story of one aspect of their home renovation and switch over to another. And then each of those stories had on average about 10 chapters. So they would have 10 individual moments which built up to them telling their overall story. The field study actually took place in 2 parts. There were actually 2 different studies. The first one was really focused on the authoring experience, the experience of telling the story, and the second one was really focused on the feedback experience. For the purposes of time, I'm going to present them together, but in the second study, participants also recruited social connections like friends or training partners or family members that they were interested in sharing with, and then we talked to them as well as talking to the participants. And we sought to evaluate the 3 different design decisions that went into Yarn. So those description suggestions, the automatic and optional data entry, and the visual templates. So now I'm going to present some of the results of that study. So towards those discussion suggestions, what we found is that for the most part, they were typically ignored. People tended to write fairly short sentences, fairly short messages. They tended to include a sentence or less for most of the story chapters that they created. And what participants described is that the prompts didn't quite match what they were trying to do. So for example, this participant said, like, what did I do today versus what are you working on, or what did you just make? I don't know, it's just too big of a question. So this participant really wanted to describe what it was that they were doing in that particular moment versus answering a bigger question of what their overall goal was. Participants did find that those prompts were particularly useful for helping them reflect a little bit more about their own experience, and they were really useful actually for journaling purposes. So one participant told us, some days the prompts did help me reflect on my run, which was nice. Another participant said that I thought the prompts were actually good ideas from what I might want to write. I didn't always follow them, but I did usually read them. So participants did find those prompts to be useful even if they didn't necessarily follow them. Towards the data entry goals, we found that most chapters tended to include visual data. So they intended to include a picture or a running map, and this was true across both of the two different versions of the app. And participants thought that this was really important as part of their storytelling. So one participant said, I just think it works so much better if you just have the photos. I think that the photos make it. Otherwise, it's just data. So the numeric data, like how far someone ran, or how long that they worked on a project, which is really central to what apps are typically sharing today, wasn't enough to make this participant feel like their audience would really gain value from it. Another participant said, I felt like not posting a picture, it's like a complete cop-out. I don't want to see a picture of a paint bucket, which was the default visual data in the DIY version of Yarn, because that's not inspiring at all. So she really wanted to make sure that she was highlighting the part of her DIY project that she was working on right now. More running stories tended to include numeric data rather than DIY stories. Participants felt like in DIY that data was viewed as a little bit more optional. One participant said, I took photos of like the steps of a project. They were renovating their house, so just like one photo per outlet. Sometimes if I have it, our money spent or whatever. So that data was additionally optional. But audience members still appreciated seeing that numeric data or the other types of data which were included. One participant said, talking about the person who she was receiving data from, she usually shared what the weather was doing. I love that time where she was running when it tried to snow. So understanding that information was helpful for this person to really relate to the person who was telling the story. So people really appreciated variety in the visual templates that we're presenting. So one participant said, I liked how there's different formats that you could use that could highlight different things. Like you could highlight how much you ran in the week or what the weather was like. And audience members particularly appreciated that variety. I like the variety of templates. But participants still tended to choose visual templates, actually, which covered up the least part of their pictures. So 2/3 of chapters or 3/4 of chapters actually used the two templates, which visually covered the templates the least. And particularly in the case of DIY participants, this is because participants really wanted to highlight the content that they had actually created. One participant described it as, the templates are killing me. I really want one which doesn't touch my image content at all. Another participant described it as, when I need to ask a question, there's also an image that communicates my question. So I wouldn't want to put so much text on top of that image because I would want people to study the image and tell me an answer. So she still really wanted the participants or the audience members to focus on that visual content. And by overlaying it like we did in Yarn, we actually detracted a little bit from what it was that she wanted to be sharing. Okay, so popping up a level to what Yarn says about how we should structure storytelling with personal data more generally. So one of the big takeaways that we had was a need to balance structure with flexibility. So participants really wish that they had more choice in how data was formatted and styled. And ephemeral storytelling features like story features in Instagram or Facebook, as well as in ephemeral social platforms like Snapchat, could offer some guidance for how to do this. Participants like the ability or like the theory of directly being able to manipulate where they place data, any text descriptions, that sort of thing. But participants also appreciated being able to show their progress. They appreciated being able that audience members could see maybe in a feed or could see a history of those different moments that they shared along the way. So ephemeral platforms, by the nature of them disappearing, don't support that kind of long storytelling that people oftentimes want. Another tension that we found was this idea of needing to facilitate documentation for oneself as well as social support for later. So in these images here, this participant actually included a lot of different photos and a lot of description of the rug that she was weaving over the course of time. And participants were really as interested in documenting their stories for themselves as they were for documenting for others. And these goals are often in tension with one another. So really detailed data and description can support later reminiscence, can support someone in looking back on their data and understanding it a little bit better. But we also found that that could be overwhelming for audiences. Audiences might just want a quick glance on what the person did and then move on. They wouldn't necessarily want a long description of each stage of the process. One other thing that we found was that it's oftentimes really difficult to gauge audience interest. So participants who are really far away from completing their accomplishments tend to want to wait to share them until they were a little bit closer to completing them. They really felt like their stories were incomplete, and sharing those in progress moments wasn't of interest to them. But tools should really expect that people's storytelling goals will evolve as the story evolves. So while they might start with a goal of documentation for themselves, as their story progresses a little bit more and gets closer to the conclusion, they might then feel more comfortable sharing it or be more interested in sharing it. And they might still want that history preserved so that someone can see all the different moments along the way. Thanks. I'm happy to take questions.